This is an inter-university collaborative studio between Pennsylvania College of Technology in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey. At Pennsylvania College of Technology, the BSD 352 Architectural Design Studio 5 is a design studio with an emphasis on adaptive reuse. The focus is on the design and representation of complex medium-sized commercial projects in varied environmental settings, which include existing buildings. Topics include the use of building information modeling as a design tool to evaluate overall building performance and energy use. Coursework includes evaluation of existing buildings, design documentation, and development of BIM through the building's life cycle with an emphasis on the design phase. 2 individual projects were pursued during the semester. At Stevens Institute of Technology, CM 560 Sustainable Design is a course that uses design with microclimate, The Secret to Comfortable Outdoor Space by Robert D. Brown, as the course content or curriculum. It's a flipped classroom. There are 2 weeks per chapter. In the first week, students do a light reading of the chapter, ideally in one setting. In the second week, they do a close read for comprehension. During that course session, the instructor reviews his personal highlighting of the chapter with the students. All course assessment is based on this content. A midterm on chapters 1, 2, and 3 is conducted, as well as a comprehensive final exam on all the chapters. The model for this study was the Penn College Architectural Studio acting as an architecture firm, and the Stevens Sustainable Design class acting as a specialized consultant engaged with that architecture firm. The process was that every Thursday, the Penn College students would be given an assignment, and it would be due the following Tuesday. They'd have the weekend to work on it. Then on that Tuesday, that next Tuesday, the students would submit their assignments, and those submissions would be transmitted to the Stevens students. During the Wednesday Sustainable Design class, the students would review and comment on each of the student submissions from Penn College. And then after the class, annotated submissions would be transmitted back to Penn College so that on the next day, on Thursday, those submissions could be reviewed by the Penn College students. And then the cycle would repeat with the next assignment being assigned, which would be due the following Tuesday. So the first studio project was based on a competition called Reuse the Lake Chapel, a small chapel on a relatively large site that was conceived as an adaptive reuse project with additional ancillary service buildings for pilgrims visiting the site. During the first iteration, students attempted to analyze the components of the site, such as prevailing winds, sun, views, existing elements on the site, and they would also propose potential placement of various programmatic elements such as parking or buildings or pathways between them. As you can see, in this case, the feedback that was provided to the student for his site plan included such things as the fact that infrastructure for people arriving on horses was not indicated. If you place the garden, if the student was to place the garden where indicated, you have to consider shadows being cast by the buildings on the garden, especially since the footprints for both the auditorium and the hospital were so small that the buildings would have to be multiple stories and would cast significant shadows. The students also thought that parking was too extensive for this use, which, due to the given road widths limiting vehicular traffic to one direction, because two cars would be unable to pass on those roads, it would be likely that there would just be a handicap drop-off, and that parking would be, off-site, with people actually walking to the site from a satellite parking lot. We noted that 2% of the maximum use for the auditorium portion of the program is just for parking spots. We also suggested that the student consider the connectivity of the use areas and the sequence of movement as the site has been laid out. And finally, we noted that the auditorium building would block sunrise over the mountains from the hotel rooms as they are placed, whose only likely access to daylight is in the mornings, since students arrive around sunset after walking through the day on their pilgrimage. Another student's concept during the first iteration prompted an opportunity for levity, with their hand holding in place the buff over their site plan, and that being likened to the claw from the movie I Go to a Better Place. In any case, our annotations are in red for this scheme. It noted that if the horses are in the far north of the site, that prevailing winds from that direction will mean that use spaces would be downwind from that source of odor. That the location of the hotel, which is sort of C-shaped, is pretty good, since sunrise over the mountains would be an interesting, compelling view as the pilgrims are getting ready to depart. We noted that there's a ratio of public space to paths to fountain to gardens that is a little problematic as currently sketched. And we also noted that an open amphitheater, which is what the auditorium is depicted in this case to be, requires a very careful consideration of solar orientation, and that needs to be revisited. The dimensions shown for the two intervention buildings is based on the based on the measurement of the existing chapel, which we used in Bluebeam to set the scale. And so it raised a question when the student stated that the theater was 80 foot long, and we were measuring it as almost twice that size, based on the scale that we were able to determine using the chapel. We also noted that there was no scale bar or north arrow, which is pretty important. During the second iteration, the site plans developed quite a bit in their sophistication. In this case, the red notes we've blown up. The primary suggestion to this student was to flip the green and purple areas, in other words, the open green or garden space, with the parking or bus stop area, and to have the axis from the chapel to the northeast be a way of orienting the entrances to the two primary buildings, the hotel and the auditorium. We also noted that the stable and the paddock, as shown, are somewhat problematic, again, because of this odor associated with the stable and a paddock. Another student's second iteration drawing, site plan, was quite comprehensive in terms of the analysis. We didn't have much to say on the actual site analysis, but we did note that this single combined hotel and auditorium building should probably be rotated in order to have a better solar orientation, and for other reasons such as views and access to the back of the house. And we even gave a point of rotation for the student to try that reorientation. By the time we get to the third iteration, site plans are becoming much more sophisticated. The students are using tools such as modeling that allows for casting shadows based on the heights of buildings, etc. And so it was interesting to note that even with this level of sophistication, that the student made a fundamental error in that shadows cast to the lower left or to the southwest would never occur, because the sun never comes from the northeast. So even when using sophisticated tools, the students tended to make these kind of fundamental errors, which is the reason they're in studio, to get that kind of stuff drilled into their brains. During the third iteration, we made the strategic decision to take one student's scheme and give more comprehensive feedback. We listed the major questions that we had based on the 4 sheets of information that were provided: a site plan, a plan of the auditorium, and a first and second floor plan for the hotel. And then we gave our findings. And some of those findings were interesting. It required quite a bit of analysis on our part. And surprisingly, the footprints are correct in scale on the site plan. The hotel plans were accurate in scale. In aggregate, the auditorium was appropriate in square footage from the program, but it had its issues. But then we gave some pretty comprehensive feedback regarding the relationship between the structures and the natural forces in terms of energy use over the building's life cycle, and the energy budgets of patrons in interior spaces as it's shown or indicated in the site plan orientations and the design of the floor plates. So we had some pretty detailed feedback to provide regarding this. Based on time, I'm not going to go into it in great significance, but maybe you've been reading some of that as I've been talking. Here are two examples of final presentation boards from the first semester project. This one by Ashley Gentile was a design that in site plan seemed highly formal and took as an example or as an influence some vernacular architecture, but then also had some modernistic elements. But the relationship between the chapel and the axis between the hotel buildings and the auditorium building in the background ended up creating some very interesting elements and a potentially highly charged public space between the two wings of the hotel, as seen in that rendering. Another final board was designed by a student named Nick Malice in the studio, and Nick's site design was very interesting because the primary circulation pathways were off axis to the buildings, creating a different view and a sense of discovery as one processed along the axis of the sidewalks. It's a very strong design concept and extremely well executed, as well as being programmatically appropriate, if a bit retrograde in terms of its stylistic concerns. So our takeaways from this process was that the students at Penn College found the extra feedback very helpful in their design process, their iterative design process on their schemes. As far as the students in the Stevens Institute of Technology Sustainable Design class, they were consistently engaged in the markup process. And the repetitive nature of the analysis of these 15 submissions every week made theory from Brown's book very real for the students. As far as both classes go, the process modeled the realities of practice in the AEC industry today. There is a lot of remote collaboration, especially post-COVID. And the default is often to throw things over the transom instead of, engaging in lengthy and expensive, online collaboration through teleconferencing tools, which burn a lot of billable hours. As far as the next steps, we need to document the study after the semester is complete, after we've had the opportunity for two-stage data analysis to inform the results, and we're going to write a 3,000-word paper. As far as directions for future research, beyond the documentation in the paper, we want to explore moving beyond remote collaboration based purely on annotative feedback. We'd like to explore options for limited inter-university student-to-student collaboration through teleconferencing. But this would have to be carefully constrained and moderated, and it would probably be subject to institutional review board for human experimentation approval because of the potential for that type of interaction going astray. Thank you for reviewing the video and our study, and we hope you will consider reading the paper.